In this module, we're talking about qualitative work in the context of assessment, and I want to spend time talking specifically about analytic procedures and working with data once we gather it. And rather than rehashing the readings, I want to share some thoughts that I've actually shared at some conferences, and so that's why you see the Murray State branded PowerPoint slide. This is actually something that I have presented a couple of times in conference settings lately, and I think it's fitting for this week or this module in our class. So jumping in, thinking about qualitative analysis, first thing is there's no easy button. You've heard this from me in other modules in this course, and if you've had me for other courses related to research or even other aspects of practice in post-secondary education, you see me reference this idea of there not being an easy button. And I think it's a theme worth repeating over and over because sometimes there are folks who think, well, I want to use qualitative methods either for a research project or for some sort of assessment effort because there's discomfort with statistics, or there's a worry that maybe we don't have enough training ourselves in statistical procedures, and we think that qualitative is going to be easier somehow. And the reality is qualitative work is not easier than quantitative work. It's a different perspective, and it's a different set of skills that are used in qualitative efforts. So the readings do get at this, and so I do want to mention that we want to understand why we might use qualitative. If the reason to use qualitative is not because we're uncomfortable with statistics or we're not good at math or whatever it is that I've heard from folks over the years about why they think they should use qualitative, and it's usually in juxtaposition to quantitative methods. So what is it? It's this big question: what does qualitative help us do? Why should we use it? Well, qualitative methods help us get a snapshot, just as a survey does. There are a number of different methods within the big umbrella of assessment, evaluation, or inquiry, as I've phrased it throughout this course. And qualitative is one of those. Qualitative efforts help us get a snapshot view of a particular phenomenon. And that's the bulk of how qualitative work gets couched, is at looking at a particular phenomenon. And there is a branch of philosophy and practice within qualitative work known as phenomenology. But looking at an individual phenomenon does not necessarily mean we're following some sort of phenomenological research design or using strictly phenomenological procedures. And so the why behind choosing qualitative methods would be that we want to understand the how and why of a phenomenon or an issue or an occurrence. Well, phenomenon and occurrence are synonyms, but it's about digging in and learning about the how and why from individual perspectives. And that's what qualitative efforts give us when we think about qualitative in terms of talking to individuals and engaging with them to learn about their perceptions, learn about their experiences. There are some other approaches to qualitative, such as document analysis. And so in the last module, when we addressed working with existing data, you might remember that in that video I talked a lot about working with policy and other documents, and that's a qualitative perspective. So qualitative work is not simply everything that's not numbers, although it's kind of become that in some ways. It's actually evolved into a very wide array of information that we can analyze, where and really the crux of qualitative is that the researcher is the analytic tool. Where in quantitative approaches, we have different statistical analyses at our disposal, and we interact with numerical data in different forms and different types all through using formulas which are built into the stats programs and into Excel or whatever we're using to do that analysis. But qualitative is really, it's about researcher as instrument. And I think it's really important to kind of keep that in mind. I'm going to share some thoughts about researcher as instrument in another format. In fact, once I'm going to get a post up from in the podcast format about researcher as instrument. So when should we use qualitative methods? Well, I think I addressed that in my lengthy talk over of the last slide with the person holding the camera, that we use qualitative methods when we want to know the how and the why of that human element. How do people experience something? How do people come to understand something, which would be an epistemological frame. So for those who are PSE students, you've had CSP or PSE 616, and in that course we addressed epistemological development as the ways in which individuals come to know the world. And so qualitative methods are useful in helping us dig into those epistemological framings, as just one example. So let's say we've got our data. What do we do now? So we've gone out and let's say we've done interviews and we've recorded and transcribed those recordings. Or we have our stack of existing documents. What do we do? Well, we need to go about the process of coding. And there are two broad categories of coding approaches: open coding and protocol-based coding. So I'll talk first about open coding after I also share this other kind of general approach to coding. When looking at a transcript, you might look at line by line of the transcript, and that's your kind of what we might refer to as a unit of analysis. And then, or we look at the entire sentence as, is there something significant within the structure of a sentence? Now, I've shared previously in this course that I do a lot of qualitative work. That's the bulk of my research interests are geared towards qualitative perspectives, and that's the bulk of my training through my doctoral program was through qualitative methods. And my general approach is using line-by-line coding because ultimately when it comes to analysis, it's not just about looking at what one person said and then looking at what another person said. The purpose of coding is to look for connections across participants. And that's what we do. So with open coding, the idea is that we go in and we don't have any a priori assumptions. And so a priori is a Latin term that basically means prior to, or those assumptions that we come in with on the front end. But also in qualitative work, we, as researchers, we acknowledge that we come into any project with a variety of biases, but we openly acknowledge those. So we don't suggest that we are looking at anything objectively, because our own individual subjectivities do come into play as when we think about researcher as instrument. So I'll use myself as an example when I'm conducting qualitative analysis. I go through and I code line by line, but I'm also stepping back and looking at the bigger picture. So line by line is a valuable tool, but I'm also at the same time looking sentence by sentence because I want to see what is coming across as being significant for this participant. And it's also important if I'm working with interview or focus group data, I'm also listening to the audio recordings again as I'm reading through the transcript. Because it's important, sometimes we don't pick up on significance in terms of what's significant for that individual until we hear certain inflections or emotion maybe coming through. So it's really important from an open coding perspective that we're not assigning codes based on the topic of our study, but we're assigning codes based on what the participants bring up and what they say. So I'll give an example. Let's say that we're conducting an assessment project that's part of our broader assessment plan, and we want to conduct individual interviews with students, and ultimately we want to try to determine or try to dig deeper into student satisfaction with concert series. Let's say that we've sent out surveys and we've gotten a decent response rate, and year after year our surveys are showing that students seem just fine with the concert series. But on social media, we see a lot of concerns coming out on social media during and after our concert series, and this has been going on for a couple of years. And that might provide the impetus for us to conduct some interviews and really try to find out from participants what's going on. And so we conduct our interviews, and then as we go through the coding process, we might find that there's a lot of concern about the presence of alcohol and drugs at these concerts. And maybe those things weren't alluded to directly in social media, but it wouldn't have come about on our survey, because maybe in our survey we were asking about satisfaction with the acts that are chosen for each concert, satisfaction with the ability for students to get tickets easily, or whatever those processes might be. But it's not until we get into the interview stage that we find out that there's some underlying concerns that could ultimately pose a threat to the success of this endeavor. So another approach is using a protocol to help us to have a framework for approaching our coding. And so this is where we conduct our analysis, and we've constructed a list of predetermined codes that maybe it's based on literature, hopefully it's based on literature, maybe it's based on a particular theory or construct. And I'll share a study that I recently completed. I looked at the foundational documents for student affairs, and I was curious to see, can we make a connection to social justice being a core value for the student affairs profession from these documents that date back to 1937. And so I used a protocol-based approach to coding the documents, and had a protocol. My protocol was based in the tenets and attributes related and connected to social justice. So I had a coding list of base codes of about 12, and then it actually expanded from there as I got into the process. And so I was actually going back and recoding as I went. So I might code one document and say, oh boy, there's this one element that keeps coming up. I'm going to look at it in others. And so I had 20 documents that I looked at. So maybe I didn't start seeing that, oh, these other things are popping up until the 4th or 5th or 6th document. So then I'm going back. And even when I got to document number 14, I saw something new that caught my eye and made me think about, oh, maybe this is a connection to this one element of social justice. So I went back to the previous documents. And so in that approach, it's a process that we refer to as being iterative. That research is iterative, and that means that there's a give and take in the process. There's a back and forth, and that also that research process is reflexive, and that means that the researcher is taking time to reflect on the research process through data collection and data analysis, making adjustments, and then is, in the example that I just shared, going back and looking at data again and doing an additional pass. One thing that's also important to think about when doing analysis, particularly when it comes to interviews or focus groups where we've got data from human participants. Increasingly, there's an expectation that more than one person is engaged in the process of coding. And so there's something that's known as intercoder reliability. And the way that the process works out is going through and, let's say, I code, and then I ask one of you to go through and code. Maybe it's open coding, or maybe it's using a protocol-based code. So let's take the protocol-based coding strategy. So we've got our code list, and we're only going to code based on the codes that are on the list. So we're not going to have that space for new codes to be discovered. So we're going to go through and code them, and we're going to each have our total number of codes, or a number of codes that we in the document. So let's say that I come up with, I've coded 100 100, or I've coded 60 items in the document, and the other person's coded 40. And when we look across them, we see that even though our numbers are different in terms of the total codes, across that, we had 85, across 100, we had a total combined in agreement of 85, so we get an 85%. So my example may have not been the best there, but basically, what's the total number of codes that are present across the two coded transcripts, and then what's the number of codes in agreement? And then that gives us a basic ratio. And this is a very, very rudimentary formula. This was actually come out of a book by Miles and Huberman in 1994. And since then, there's been a good bit of work looking to make this approach to intercoder reliability calculation more sophisticated. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, let me know, and I'll share a couple of resources with you that I've come across in the last couple of years. So we've done our coding. Now what do we do? Well, if you read qualitative research, sometimes you see this language of emergent themes. And the image that I get is that these themes are magically emerging out of the text. And that's not what happens at all. There's nothing that emerges. The researcher is the analytic tool, and so the researcher is determining the connections among codes, and the most significant of those connections are what become themes. It's as simple as that. There's nothing magical about determining themes. It's about with the researcher engaging in empirical analysis. What are the themes? What are the significant connections? So when we write about themes, we don't want to simply write out the answers to interview questions or do some sort of question by question. Here's what seemed to be the most interesting to me. That's not analysis. And it's not a matter of simply providing a series of block quotes. We have to provide the connections across those quotes. What is it that made a particular quote significant? What does it tell us about a theme? And that's what Clifford Geertz referred to as thick, rich description in 1973. That as the researcher, as the person writing about the findings of this research study, the researcher has to provide depth in analysis so that other people get a sense of what's going on, what are these connections, what's significant out of what these people have said. And it can be helpful when approaching this task of writing up findings from a qualitative study to think of ways to organize all of this material. So are there themes, does each theme rest on its own, or are they nested somehow? Is there some upper level theme that other themes are couched under? That's actually the approach I took with my dissertation. I actually had 12 themes, which is actually a lot. for a qualitative study. I did a focus group study and I had, I want to say about 50 uh, participants across a number of focus groups. I think across 5 or 6 focus groups. So I had a lot of data. Each focus group lasted for at least an hour. A couple of them went for an hour and a half. So I had a lot of data, and it was rich data. Students weren't just going off topic; they were really getting into what I was asking about. And so I had 12 themes spread, but I had them each a set of themes, generally 3. I think I had a couple of groups of 2, couched underneath kind of what I termed as super themes. Um, and so it's just a way to help me organize and think through things. So I hope that this has provided kind of a good snapshot for you of thinking about how to act, the actual how to of engaging with qualitative data in assessment.